We'll talk about generating a standard for how services and messages, generally how you want to handle success and failure and what those mean and how people will know when it happens. And then also the notion of what we do about success and failure. There's in services when we write code, there's actually technical success and there's technical failures or business success and business failures. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then what the remediation looks like and why it's better to plan ahead than just kind of wander around and end up with a few dozen or a few hundred or a few thousand services that all behave and messages that all behave differently. So one of the things I want to talk about real quick. So I was in a really heated discussion a few years back with somebody who I have a lot of respect for. And their view was when you did something, made a service call or a message, that it either succeeded or it failed. And I like really have gotten past that or don't buy that anymore. You can have partial success. It could be that well, shopping cart's an easy one, right? I put 5 things in the cart. We go to order them. I go to get them shipped. One of them's out of stock. The other 4 ship, right? The service calls might succeed, but you could argue that's partial success. Like to the end user, that's partial success. And so if you have business rules around it, you got to do something with it. Another one is soft errors. So a hard error is something that stops you immediately. I should probably do another talk on this. And a soft error is one that like we might stop. And then if you go, no, I really want to do that anyway, we'll continue. So the shopping cart's a good example, right? Like if I were to order 5 things and 4 were there and 1 wasn't, the cart might offer, hey, do you still want to order this? You're only going to get 4 out of the 5. That's an error, right? It stopped you from processing. It couldn't do the order, but it's a soft error and you can go, yeah, I accept that. And then it'll order the 4 things and it'll either waitlist the 5th or drop it. So when you look at services, I think this is a big deal. You got to take into account, most people only think about the happy path. And really, you got to think about the unhappy path. And that's total failure or partial failure. And the reason we want to standardize this is so that we can actually wire this up to our infrastructure and have a common understanding and build dashboards around it, right? Like if every service behaves a little differently, there's no way for us to build a common dashboard across an organization. It turns out there's all kinds of weird things that can happen, and we probably need to think about what that means. So let's look at success. So if this is a service or some kind of business process and it succeeds and there's no errors, that's no big deal. But you might also have soft errors. And so there may be behavior around that. Like you actually ship the order and then you put it in a bucket somewhere that says, hey, this inventory thing's really not working. We got to come back and triage this again later and figure out what happened, right? Or figure out why this is happening. And then on the failure mode, I would actually argue there's technical failures and business failures. So I'm going to start with technical failures first. So technical failures are when some piece of infrastructure, like a network, can't be reached, or there's some other piece of infrastructure we just don't have. We don't have the inventory. That's sort of a technical failure. So well, that would kind of be a business one. So anyway, so technical failure, right? There's 2 outcomes from technical failure. We can be retry ready. So it could be that there's some technical failure and it's like, hey, we couldn't get to the inventory system out there for that cart, but I'm going to keep retrying, right? There was a technical failure there and we'll try for some period of time. It could also be a technical failure that the system doesn't know how to retry. It's not a retry ready failure. And in that case, we're going to queue that up for some technical person. Some truck failed diagnostics. And so we try and reset it, doesn't work, and then it goes into the repair shop. So that's technical failure, right? And there's 2 outcomes from technical failure. They're both failures. One of them requires some type of human or other higher level intervention, and then, that sounded weird, or it could be something that's retry ready. On the business side, I would actually argue we have 3 kinds of failures. So we have some catastrophic business rule failure that we didn't know what to do. I worked somewhere, and if we couldn't sell a car policy because that model wasn't in our database, that was actually not a technical failure. It was a business rule. The car needed to be in our database. We didn't have a 2035 Mustang, right? And so what would happen in that case? And so it might be that we triage it and we're like, dude, the 2035 Mustang's already been put out. It's just not in our database. We need to fix that. And then anybody that comes through will fix that, right? Like the business needed to do some estimation on the risk on a whatever. And another kind would be a retry ready business failure. So, hey, we really needed to get a rating for this or a credit score to make this thing happen, and we couldn't. That's kind of a business failure, right? Because the business process could say, you know what, we're going to sell it anyway, or we're still going to issue the card, or we're not. Or we could wait a while and we'd be like, we have this backup plan for this, and then we'll retry again, right? Another one is auto handle. So that would be like the example of a credit score. You could decide you had previous history with a customer, and so the process is you need a credit score. But if you had enough history with us and we don't see anything, we're going to auto handle that. It's still a failure of the official process, but we had a handling behavior for that. So in this case, like I said, we've got success, but I'm arguing there's two kinds of success. Full success with no errors, and then there are partial success or soft errors maybe, which could then turn into full success. So you really need to think about that if you're designing your services. So if you're building a computer system or any kind of operation, you really want some standard behavior around these three types of failures and the outcomes of those. And then people can implement what they need to meet the requirements or the non-functional requirements that you put together for those modes. So that's really, and that's kind of what I talked about here in the blog. On success, do you have complete success or do you have partial success, right? You got 4 out of 5s in the cart. Or soft error. It turns out that everything can be delivered in 2 days except for this thing, which is a week. We actually can get you the inventory, but it won't come in the 2 days. That's kind of a soft error. Do you still want it? And we talked a little bit about business failures, right? And whether a business failure is retry ready. And in some cases, business failures and technical failures look the same. When they're retry ready, it's because we're going to come back later and try again. Like I had one with a quoting system, and we couldn't give a customer quote immediately, but we guaranteed a quote within 12 hours. And we would try again, and if that didn't work, the business triage was actually get a person manually generate the quote for them. Right? So that would be an example of a business triage. It might be that it's usually some exception process on the business side. And then on technical failures, we have the same thing. We got technical triage, which usually means somebody's got to go out and figure out what happened. They got to dig into it. Or it could be retry ready. Like it might be, hey, we realize that this data gets loaded incorrectly on a regular basis. So we're going to load it, and then we're going to retry this thing and see if we can generate it. So if you look at that was all like web services, but you have the same thing in asynchronous. So if you're doing messaging or streaming, like big data streaming platform for some of this, you may actually end up some of this, the auto retry or the triage, right? Which would be like the technical team or the business team going in and handling that. The same problem happens in the messaging space. I don't know. I thought this was funny when I put it in two computers meet in a bar, and how do they know if they're communicating? So I had this two computers meet in a bar thing, and like, how do they know if they're actually sending the same messages, right? It's like two people separated by a common language. The same thing can happen with two teams or two pieces of software talk to each other, or two organizations, right? Like they think they know what that meant, but they're not necessarily sure. And can they be partially successful? Yeah, we're going to fulfill part of that order. We're still going to work with you on this. Maybe we're not going to work on you. The reason I broke out the business and technical is it really came down to who owns the failure. If there's a failure to communicate or a failure to generate a success, who owns that? In the computer world, if it's like a networking problem or something, it's a technical problem. But there could be a business problem. Like there were no business rules to handle this, so it failed. That's a business problem, not a technical problem. Nobody figured out what the situation would be. We're in the middle of a pandemic and somebody can't make their rent. Well, we didn't code for what that meant for a payment plan. When we're successful even, it's confusing. And that's partially through partial success, right? And again, partial success is possible in some systems. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And what will happen when somebody returns success? It might be that they return success with a message, or they return, hey, we got the car you wanted. Oh, but it doesn't have, the 18 speakers. So they think it's a success. You might view that as a failure and have to do something about it. And then I just had these other things in here, did we fail? When a business rule finds an error, what do we expect to have happen? Do we support softwares where there can be like a human override or some other behavioral override, a behavioral imperative? We're only going to get half the mass shipped that we want. Normally we wouldn't send it, but because it's a pandemic, we're going to ship them all. If there's no retry, what's going to happen? So really what it comes down to is plan ahead. Owning failure is painful. Owning success, man, everybody wants to be behind success. But the hardest thing in building a reliable system, either software or organizational, is planning ahead and identifying what the failure modes can be and who owns them and which ones can be fixed by themselves. So that's where I'm at with this. I hope maybe this will spur some conversations for you. and have a great day.